In today's presentation, we're going to have one of our book chapters, which is titled Redefining Online Hate Speech, Frameworks and Realities in Rapidly Evolving Political Contexts by Professors Iginio Gagliardone and Matti Pohjonen. Iginio is based at Wits University in South Africa, and Matti is based at the University of Helsinki in Finland. I'll just start by reading the abstract, and then we can pass it on to our presenters. Building on the dramatic political transformations that occurred in Ethiopia since 2015, this presentation examines the potentials and limits of strategies to recognize and analyze hate speech in polarized societies. It reflects on how analytical framers devise to address a political context characterized by tight control of a specific group over others may need to be radically rethought when such a group loses a grip on power, unleashing deep-rooted sentiment of resentment and retribution. This experience is used as a starting point to consider the importance of paying close attention to shifting power dynamics in conflict scenarios and devise appropriate measures to both recognize hate speech and its potential to lead to widespread violence. And my name is Babak Bahadur. I'll be moderating, and we will now have about 30 minutes for the presentation, and then we'll go to Q&A. You're welcome to put your questions in the chat. That's probably the most efficient way to do it. So feel free to add your questions to the chat, and we will address those in the turn they come in. So I'll pass it on to Iginio and Matti.
Great, thanks. So we're going to try to have kind of a joint presentation. So we'll see how that goes. And I think for sake of clarity, we will take turns in talking so that it won't get too kind of complex and too messy. So what we'll be doing is that I'll be talking first and going through kind of the first half of the presentation. And then I'll hand over to Iginio, and feel free, Iginio, to jump in at any point if there's any additional clarifications that you want to put in. And this is by all means a joint work that we have been working on for quite a long time, and from different perspectives, but having a lot of kind of similar kind of perspectives. So yeah, so I'm hearing a bit of noise in the background, but I think that should be fine. So what we'll talk about today, and is in a way to talk about the book chapter that we have been contributing to the project called Redefining Online Hate Speech, Frameworks and Realities.
No, that's fine. Thank you very much.
In political context. And what we'll try to do is unravel, open up some of the themes that we have been addressing in the chapter, and in a way covering a long-term engagement that we have been dealing with, looking at debates on social media hate speech, specifically in Ethiopia, and specifically looking at the kind of unique dynamics of the Ethiopian context, going back all the way until about 2014. So it's already about a 7-8 year engagement with the debates. And as most of you know, there has been a lot of focus recently, especially in the past year, on the Ethiopian conflict. So we'll try to kind of look backwards into the work we have been doing as also a means, as a way to understand the current situation, or to provide some insights in the current situation, what has been going on. And I'll very briefly talk about some of the kind of high profile of Ethiopia within the kind of global hate speech discourse as well in the last, especially last year, and with the onset of the Tigray conflict. So specifically, what we'll talk about today is, and we thought that the best way to structure the presentation is to talk about a number of kind of themes that the chapter introduces and some of the questions that the chapter raises, and then leave as much room as possible for thoughts and discussions, and in a way try to get more ideas as we move towards the final edit, or the final kind of version of the chapter. And so the first thing that I'll do is I'll very briefly discuss background to the Ethiopian conflict, and this is purely to give context and give ideas about what the kind of broader themes are that we address in the book, and also being aware that not everybody has that kind of long-term research engagement with what has been going on in the Ethiopian context. So just very briefly introduce some of the themes that help also understand our concept of trying to understand and problematize research that works with the context in the Ethiopian context. Then a very central part of the chapter is in a way reflecting back from the current moment, looking at what we on the research framework that we developed for the Mechachal project, which was a 2-year engagement looking at social media hate speech in the Ethiopian context, and we'll start introducing some of the issues that we're dealing with, some of the methodological questions, in a way try to address some of the problems that we have been also raising in the chapter, and then use that kind of background to open up some of the key themes of the chapter, and especially working around the idea of context and how do you understand, mitigate, how do you understand the problem of online hate speech when in situations of rapidly changing context and power relations, and what kind of questions we might want to raise around that. And then, as I said, the idea is to let's try to have a very good discussion and also see how these ideas, what kind of questions and comments this raises from the audience as well. So jumping straight into it, knowing that half an hour seems like a long time, but usually it's actually very short. So I will jump straight into the current moment. And as most of you have probably been seeing in the news coverage recently, Ethiopia has been very much in the limelight, in especially debates around online hate speech and content moderation, this platform accountability. And so we had the oversight board ruling for the first time in the Ethiopian context. And there was a kind of raising alarm around Facebook role in the Ethiopian in the conflict. And there's a kind of need for assessing the feasibility of independent human rights study related to work in Ethiopia coming out of the oversight board's decisions. There has been increased discussion around the complicity of the role of hate speech in the Ethiopian conflict, for the point that some articles have been talking about ethnic violence, pushing danger to close genocide. So these are the kind of key issues that set the stage or set the background to the kind of debate that we're having, and in a way trying to open up what is going on behind these headlines. And Ethiopia was also one of the countries mentioned in the Pohjonen revelations, or the Pohjonen papers, Facebook papers, as one of the cases where this kind of content moderation and the challenge of content moderation has been relatively problematic in the recent years. So if you look at the context of Ethiopia, and this is basically just to provide a very brief historical context into some of the developments and the socio-political changes that have been taking place in the Ethiopian context. And this, in a way, forms some of the backdrop or the political history into which a lot of these debates are placed into. So Ethiopia, if you look at the very brief history post-Civil War Ethiopia in 1991, and some of these terms we'll be mentioning also in our discussions, is that post-1991, after years of protracted civil war against the Derg, which was the previous military regime that held power in Ethiopia for 25 years, the TPLF, which is the Tigrinian People's Liberation Front, comes into power after the civil war, and Tigrinian Liberation Front comes from the province of Tigray, and they kind of form a national coalition that is Tigray-led, that forms what is called the EPDRF, or the Ethiopian People's Revolution Democratic Front, which rules the country in a relatively strong authoritarian manner until 2018, including imposing very strict controls on media freedoms, and also very strong controls on social media debates or in terms of how the social media space has been regulated in the Ethiopian context. And some of the recent protests that we are discussing, there was an escalation of youth protests against the ruling coalition, following which some concessions were made, and the current Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed comes to power in 2018, and which kind of starts the reshuffling of the Ethiopian political system, which changes very quickly. And within a matter of years, there is a big reshuffling of the power dynamics within the Ethiopian kind of political dynamics and power relations. So Ethiopia, Eritrea signed a peace agreement. Abiy Ahmed gets the Nobel Peace Prize, and then sets to start reforming the political system in the country, which includes in 2019 dismantling the Ethiopian People's Revolution Democratic Front, EPRDF, and forms a new party, and ousting the Tigray-led party TPLF from the coalition. And after continued tensions in 2020, there is a kind of Tigray decides to go on with the national vote. Again, Tigray being the northern province, and despite the government's delay of the national elections, and the conflict begins, and there's this complicated political relations that underlie. But the key point here is that in terms of, if you look at the changing power relations, So what used to be a more dominant figure within the Ethiopian political system, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, or the Tigray-led coalition, then becomes reshuffled into becoming, or ousted from the mainstream political discussion. And then that's kind of underpinning some of the conflict that has been going on in the last year. So in this context, just to briefly introduce what we were doing and also reflecting back on the work that we have been doing, this the kind of discussions, the debates which we have been discussing involve a long-term engagement during the time when the EPDRF was in power, so before the change happened. So this was in between 2014 and 2017. We're engaging in a number of projects looking at social media hate speech in the Ethiopian context. And so one of the kind of key projects that we worked on was called Mechachal, and it looked at online debates, social media hate speech during the elections in 2016, the Ethiopian context, and then looking at various kind of dynamics around that. So what I'll briefly talk about is the context during which we started this research project, some of the methodological choices we had adopted, and then we can then start building from some of the work that has been going around that. And I'm just checking time so we don't go too far around. So when we started working with the Mechachal project, I'll go back in the slides, there was a big concern within the Ethiopian context that there was an escalation of online social media hate speech taking place within the Ethiopian kind of online spaces and online discussions. And as often happens, once you start looking for it, you do find a lot of very strongly worded, very offensive, very vitriolic conversations going on online. And you can see just a few quotes from that just from the research we're doing. And these are anecdotal quotes that we're finding from online social media conversations. And you can see all the kind of hallmarks of very dangerous extreme speech being played out here, dealing with things like calling the ruling party or the ethnicity behind the ruling party a rabid dog that needs to be ferociously taken care of. And these are the kind of hallmarks that have often been linked to very strong ethnic violent speech and also kind of slaughtering, burying, and all the terms that exist. So what we were interested in trying to figure out in 2015, 2016, within the Ethiopian context, and how could we then start looking at the kind of concerns, debates around social media hate speech within the Ethiopian online conversations, and as well as during the upcoming elections that were taking place in 2016. And the idea there was that there were a number of things that we wanted to consider at that point. And one of them was, if you start looking at the context of what was going on, was that at that point, Ethiopia had a relatively strong government system in place, relatively authoritarian government system in place, which had quite strict controls over social media conversations. So one of the things we wanted to do is that not automatically go into looking at social media hate speech as trying to understand the types of conversations that were taking place, but looking at broader the context, the prevalence, to see how much of it was there and how it potentially linked to the ongoing social media dynamics and the political dynamics that were taking place. And just kind of as a part of the process that we're working with, this is an example of one of the stakeholder meetings we had when we're trying to decide what would be an appropriate methodology to start looking at or start identifying and also understand the risks of online hate speech within a context where there's both polarized political systems between the opposition and the government, but also a relatively strong government presence and relatively strong control over the social media spaces. And one of the things that we were interested in, and Iginio will probably talk about this also, is that we didn't want to sound overly alarmist of what was going on before we actually knew the context and what was going on. And so that way we would not give additional, at least rhetorical support the government for censoring online spaces. So we wanted to understand both in terms of the conflict dynamics, what methodology would be most suitable for this. And we hosted a number of discussions around that, but also then how could we then look at the broader dynamics, which would not be as alarmist as if you look at only the comments themselves sometimes might indicate. And so we came up with a relatively complicated framework of trying to look at debates in the Ethiopian context. And to cut a long story short, there's a lot of methodological discussion. We ended up trying to provide a sample frame of the entirety of the Ethiopian social media conversations using number of sampling selections and number of random trends, events, issues, elections, intercoder reliability test. We had a number of research assistants who were working, coding and kind of trying to provide a very detailed understanding of various different components that come into play. And in the end, we ended up manually coding over 15,000, I think it was over 15,000 Facebook statements and comments as a way of trying to look at this context and nuance into it. But I'm going to hand over to Iginio now that we have started with the research section, and Iginio can then probably talk about how we selected our conceptual framework behind this methodological decisions that we were making at that point. So Iginio, jump in.
Great. And no, thanks a lot, Matti. And one thing that I wanted, you already mentioned it, but I wanted to add is, this is the project, but one thing that we, and the project is relatively dated, 2014, 2015, 2016. But the opportunity that we took for, as part of this book, as our contribution, is something that I don't think happens very often, which is we sort of asked ourselves reflexively, did we make any mistakes? And the chapter is an attempt to articulate and make these potential mistakes. We're still, we're still convinced of what we did at the time, but then history changed in dramatic ways, as Matti has said. So the question that we're asking is, should we have done things differently? And I want to bring the 2 or 3 key elements here, just summarizing something that Matti already said. And the transition in Ethiopia, it's unique. A country that was dominated by, let's call it, it's complicated and simplified, by a minority for 30 years, pushed, and this minority was strongly authoritarian, in control of the government, in control of the military, in control of the intelligence. In a short span of a couple of years, became not just minoritarian, but was pushed on the side so much so that he decided to go back up in arm and fight against the country that it used to control. So this is, we have to go back to the Second World War to find an example of this kind. So the kind of thinking that we did at the time, and it will become clear also as we can continue with the slides, is there is an all-domineering government which has an interest in us researchers finding hate speech to justify some of the control on its imposing, not just censoring, but also imprisoning political opponents. And as the project progressed, we also found that the vast majority of hate speech and dangerous speech was targeting the very minority group from which the government was hailing. And so the way in which we decided to take context into consideration is just not taking just the context in terms of like the context of the Speech Act, but the power dynamics that were at work at the time. And so the question that I'm asking now, it will become clear later, is if we had applied a less contextually driven definition of hate speech that didn't take into consideration that the TPLF was in control of everything, our research might have rang the alarm bell of a growing and potentially dangerous anti-Tigrayan sentiment that became very apparent in 2018 and 2019. So should we have done, should we adopted a definition of a speech more by the book? Now I'm going back to the slide. I have to do the annoying things of asking Matti to move the slides because he's in control. So I know it's not fun for you and for who is in this virtual room, but we haven't found another way. So going to, again, this is the core argument that we want to make today, but context is many things. Context is the one that Matti explained. Context for a researcher or a group of researchers, he is being able to to master and understand and master very complex political trajectories, grievances that didn't occur a year before, 4 years before, but decades before. And the challenge is putting that into a framework for analysis. But context is, and Matti already mentioned that, also the context of the larger set of debates that occur and are not limited to hate speech. Because one of the criticisms that we made in a number of publications is if someone is looking for hate speech, is going to find hate speech and it's going to magnify hate speech. And if you magnify hate speech too much, the risk is creating a sense of moral panic, of like the whole internet as being taken out of hand, out of its original project. And what we try to do with Mecha Chal, and we advocate, we were in a very unique situation, and it's quite detailed, but we can go into that in the question and answer if there is an interest, is seeing how that particular portion of online debates that we categorize as hate speech was representative or non-representative of the broad variety of conversation that were happening at the time. So this is the slide. Again, this is not central to the core argument for today's presentation, but we had quite a bit of resources. We had a lot of coders, all of them apart from one, hailing from Ethiopia, but living in diaspora because of political sensitivity. And one first distinction that we were making when analyzing statements that were sampled was between statements that were going against and going towards. So the going against was the beginning of our analysis of whether or not something is hate speech. The going towards was allowing a certain level of political animosity. You know, we may disagree even vehemently, but we recognize each other as legitimate actors in a political debate or any kind of conversation, which doesn't happen very often. You know, usually, social media, the tendency to talk past of the fact that you hail from a specific group is enough to context in a different conception to push back or to not listen. And now, Matti, I guess we can go to the next one, and so, or maybe even to the next one, because I think this is a lot of text. The visualization can help. So we decided once a statement was collectively categorized as going against, that's where this layered analysis that is done for a decision tree started occurring. So the first layer was based on, and maybe we can go back a second so you can see the context, and here's a description, not the previous, okay. So this is the ground on which an individual is being targeted. We go back to the ICCPR. And so politics is out of the equation, and we can talk about it. Matti and I wrote other articles and publications saying that actually politics, we've been using another term, which is extreme speech, is an important component of vitriolic exchanges. But again, we wanted to have some international recognized starting point that could be accepted by all the stakeholders involved, the government, the oppositions, bloggers, and so forth. The second one, so it was ethnicity, religion, gender, and so forth. So the second layer was the content, which is what in most of computational methods for analyzing hate speech relies on. And so it's center structures and keywords and so forth. The third one was, and again, this goes back to a rooting into legislation, is whether or not there was an incitement to do something. But the fourth one for the argument we're making for the chapter we are writing here is the most important, which, and I'm not aware of many other framework to analyze hate speech that consider power dynamics to this extent. And this is where we say maybe it was a mistake, but we couldn't predict history. So the final one is whether or not the group that is being targeted has the means to protect itself. And then we can go, Matti, to the next slide, and where we can focus on the very bottom one, the previous one, the tree, right? So if you focus on the light red and the dark red, And so that question is, once there was targeting based on ethnicity or religion and so forth, the content, you've seen some example before, could amount to vitriolic, and in addition to that, an incitement to do something targeting that particular group. The question was, does that group can call upon institution to protect itself? So in 2015, the TPLF/EPRDF dominated Ethiopia had very much the means to protect the Tigrayan minority, but any other power actors that were seen essential to the domination and control of Ethiopia. You fast forward 3 years, 4 years, and you see that this situation has not dramatically changed, but basically flipped. And there have been many cases, Matti mentioned it before, of violence in Tigray, but also violence, ethnic violence in the big cities. Tigrayan, they are being targeted, and this kind of violence doesn't have specific means to appeal to authorities. They're going to protect the targets, and so again, the question, and I hope there will be a discussion on this, is is there a paralleling context? When we take context in such a detailed account, we understand that we don't want to play into the hands of a government. We understand that certain forces are dominating public debates, are dominating means to do violence and to protect violence, and it might come with consequence later on. And this is the interesting discussion. And I guess we can move to, I think we have just a couple of more slides, if I'm correct. So this is just the results of the project at the time. In the end, hate speech was minimal, but hate speech was minimal also because it was processed through this specific set of decisions. And I don't think I need to return to it. And then if we go to the next one, is that's sliced into what we consider the offensive speech, hate speech, or dangerous speech, which is just 0. Where hate speech was 0.7%, and then if you add 1.5%, you will get to a little more. And so, trying to conclude and getting to the kind of larger questions that this reflexive account calls upon. We offered one example of context and how we took into account, but we also, and this is not based only on our own experience, but also on observations of how context is called upon. Context is desperately needed, but context is also very dangerous, especially when context becomes this kind of due diligence by which certain institutions, certain organizations, being aware of the limits of a technocentric, exclusively based on machine learning models of detecting hate speech, seek to appeal to context. But as we have shown, context is complicated. Context can backfire. And this is a wonderful quote. Maybe I'm going to pass to Matti because he's the one who found the quote, so I don't want to appropriate it for myself. And I think it's precious. Before we wrote this article, we had an understanding of context, but we didn't come across certain literature. And it's context is indefinitely expandable. And some organization, we can have a discussion about Facebook over sideboard. We are looking at context. We are calling upon the experts. But who are the experts? I was part of some of this panel. There is a bit of cherry picking and there's a bit of ventriloquism. You call upon the people that tend to be in your network, and maybe I'm going to confirm what you already know, rather than people who are more radically on the opposite ends of what is being what one may think. And it's really important, since context can be expanded ad infinitum, as researchers to be transparent about which specific portion of an overexpanding context have been taken into consideration to make this decision. And this kind of intellectual honesty doesn't come out very often. And there's kind of like a sense of self-confidence. Oh, but we have looked at context, as if that generic reference could be enough in validating a project. So I'm going to pass back the ball to Matti, and I guess we can just, maybe some of you have read it already, so we don't need to reread it. And I will leave it to you to conclude, but I guess the key elements are already there. So, and I see it's 5:34 for Matti and myself. I think it's 10:30 for those connecting from the US, and I'm sure there are many time zones around here. So I think we did our 30 minutes. So over to you, Matti.
Also keep it relatively short. So maybe a number of things very quickly to add. And so as Iginio was talking about context within this framework, or the way I kind of interpret from the quote that we have been using, is that it is always about choice, that context is not something neutral you can access, but rather what specific factors or conditions or variables, if you want, that you pick up from the situation that is going on, or the context you're going on. Always a choice that you make as a researcher. That is it's a pragmatic sometimes choice, but also a choice that you select certain parts of it by excluding others. And especially when you look at a conflict situation like Ethiopia at the current moment, it becomes very difficult to choose context in a neutral way without taking side or being involved in the conflict dynamics, because in a very extreme escalating conflict, context itself is what is at stake often. So if you look at the contemporary debates that are going on the social media crisis or the social media conflict in Ethiopia, and the lack of verified facts from the ground, so the context itself becomes also part of the conflict. So it is the whole idea there is to problematize that there is some kind of neutral, transparent context that you can easily access. And the idea comes from anthropology that, in a way, the researcher itself is always implicated in selecting certain parts of the context and interpreting it and using it in a certain way. So in the methodological framework, we were also looking at the context within the kind of deliberations that we had with the stakeholders in Ethiopia, and selecting certain parts of the context that were relevant for the research at the current moment. And so I think the last thing, which we are also building up in the chapter before we can conclude, is that oftentimes such complicated theoretical and philosophical debates around context become difficult when you're using certain computational or machine learning models, which are becoming very popular in contemporary research on online hate speech, because they depend on certain type of relatively non-problematic understanding of what is considered hate speech, which becomes very difficult if you take this kind of complicated nature of context into account. So you have certain key terms, you have certain machine learning models, and they have to be grounded in some kind of a very relatively simplistic form of reality or real understanding of what is going on. Whereas if you look at the context as this fluctuating, complicated set of interpretations, some of these models become very difficult to in a way devise in a way, or sometimes impossible to do in a way that takes into account some of these contextual factors. So these are the two themes that we were interested in picking up from this debate around how do we then, reflecting back on what we were doing in 2015 and in terms of the contemporary research, how can we then both understand the importance of context, but also raise some questions and challenges around what is meant by context, and how do we pay due justice in terms of, especially when situations are extremely complicated and very difficult to capture in a very simple framework. So I think that's the kind of where I would come from into this debate. So we can maybe conclude and we can both do this. So just some of the key themes of the chapter, and I'm sure people can read about this. And so it is one of the idea. What we wanted to problematize is that, in a way, Facebook, the idea of technocentrism, that is sometimes it is more complex than social media causing something. There is this complicated historical, social, political dynamics behind it. That is as important, if not much more important, than understanding the kind of technological dynamics and the context which we have been discussing throughout the presentation, and how that can change, and how the power dynamics can shift within certain frameworks. And then also the last kind of point that often is being made is that if you look at some of the ideas around social media hate speech, and especially around the kind of how again Facebook revelations, there's very little actual empirical work that would look in detail in countries such as Ethiopia, and so to understand the complexities of the global South and the complex political histories. So I think I'll leave it at that. I don't know, Iginio, if you have anything else to summarize some of the things. So I think that's the kind of wrap up for.
I guess we can. I see Babak is on screen again, so look forward to the exchange and conversation and questions.
Leave it at this last slide for the time being.
Great. Thank you very much, Matti and Iginio, for your insights and sharing some of your research with us. And it's really interesting for me to see the evolution of this research. You know, you started this back in 2013, and I think the approach you're taking, a learning approach of looking at as events and research, you know, continue in this area of adapting your work and updating it. I think it's quite an interesting approach that we should all consider. So we've had a question from Steve Youngblood. I'll just read it. He said, very interesting, thank you. Of the 2.2% with offensive, hate, dangerous speech, do you know the reach of these pages? Are they hugely popular pages or smaller, isolated pages?
Well, I don't know if I can. It's a good question. It's the internet and Facebook in Ethiopia in 2015 is so different from what it is 7 years later, as you may imagine. But in the sampling that there was a slide there, we did select only pages that for the criteria of the time were already popular. So we just selected only pages and groups that pass a certain threshold in terms of followers and so forth. So that constituted, and then we got, this is the slide, 1,055 pages from which we sample. So those were relatively popular, you know, for today's standards will be like, you know, very small numbers, but at the time Ethiopia had like 3 or 4% internet penetration. So it was pretty minimal, but the discussions were Facebook for many was the internet, and it was Twitter now has taken the lead also because of the war, and was the main platform for conversation among those who could afford it.
Great, thank you for that. And I think our next question is from Laura Livingston, who's also a co-editor of the book. So I'll pass it on to Laura.
Sure, thank you so much. My question is more from a practical standpoint. Given how tenuous context and power dynamics can be, as you've highlighted throughout this presentation, what can projects that are seeking to address hate speech do to take into account how fluid these dynamics are and how quickly they can change?
Do you want to go, Iginio, or I can?
Just I took chance to get started. I might join you later.
I think we might have kind of complementary, but also in opinions on this. But so I think what we did, which I think was very unique with the MetChachal project in 2014, 2016, is that when we were developing the methodology for the research, we were very aware that we didn't want to come in exclusively as outsiders to decide how to define everything that was going on. So the picture I showed with, which I can go back very quickly here, which is one of the meetings that we held, was to get the number of stakeholders from opposing parts of the political spectrum. So we had the government opposition, we had UNESCO, we had church members, we had the blogger community, and we had very painstaking discussions around how do we define what hate speech is within this turbulent context. And obviously that it, as a kind of a work process, is very time consuming and very difficult, but this way we could feel a certain degree of at least that we have done our due diligence by getting as many people involved discussing and also agreeing on the methodology that we're using. So I think one thing from my point that could be, or my perspective, that could be brought into this rapidly changing situation is to have this kind of deliberations around what is in fact going on, and this deliberation of course change and is a constant process, but also including not only the researcher into the kind of framework of deciding on these things, but making it a more kind of stakeholder led situation. So that would be where I would kind of start untangling. I don't know
if I can just add a couple of things, because it seems in many intervention from NGOs, from governments, and so forth, there is a tendency to pre-select who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. And in some cases, that's fine. It's quite easy, but it also comes with constraint. The Ethiopian government at the time was very much the bad guy, but it was important to have the bad guys around the table. And it was a tremendous effort. It was like, working with local universities and colleagues who have been working out for a very long time. Around the table, there are two people, and one of them unfortunately passed away. And one was the public prosecutor who put in prison the person at the opposite end of the aisle. So you can imagine the kind of like heated debate that occurred at the beginning. We had really to play the academic. No, we are academic. We are not deciding who was right and who was wrong when one went in prison and the other one put it in prison. We're talking about something different. So it was probably one of the most, they had to put so much effort in that workshop, but it was incredibly interesting. Nobody was falling asleep, that's for sure. And so that's one component. Doing the and there is the whole current of anthropologists that comes with the kind of short sentences doing research with people we don't like. And often there are the people that we don't like that do have a significant role in producing hate speech and vitriol and so forth. And I'm not saying that everybody should be in the room. Again, it's again to context. You can expand it to have like, Ethiopia is 120 million people. You have to have 120 million people in the room. That's clearly not possible. But doing this extra effort, sort of like having the curiosity to listen to the argument, to the vision of also people that we might normally, and from a personal point of view, and dislike, and not and that's very complicated.
Maybe just adding onto that, one of the theoretical trajectories that I was working, especially following the Ethiopian research. Well, I'm not on mute, yeah. One of the theoretical trajectories that I was working with was, in a way, there are two parallel debates often going on. One is this extremism, where you have the kind of mainstream and you have extremism on the periphery, and you work on that. And then there's a more kind of conflict mediation framework, which tries to stay away from identifying clear-cut outsider culprits, but rather looks at the conflict dynamics. And there are two different ways that, in a way, from my own theoretical perspective, you can approach the issue. So you can also look at in certain situations, especially in conflict situations, as a form of kind of polarized conflict dynamics as well, and which might be useful for some research on online hate speech.
Great, thank you for that. I think we have a question from George Weiss. George, do you have your hand up? Please proceed.
Hi. Yeah. So hi, Iginio, and nice to see you again. And well, I don't know. Actually, I got maybe a little bit confused now in the last answer to the last question. I'm simply, from a practitioner point of view, looking to evolve a general set of criteria on how to judge hate speech, which is what you were just talking about now, but in terms of transmitting it to the simple person on the street in order to recognize it. So with the problems that you encountered, I'm just asking about the second line, the generalizability of your research in Mahai. Is that going to be in the book? Are we going to see like a table of criteria or something like that that we can use in terms of our interventions, which has enlarged the criteria which we apply to hate speech with the context problems that you have outlined? Is that a clear question?
Yeah, no. In terms of generalizability, to be honest, I don't think that project could take place today. And we had a fantastic group of coders from different ethnic backgrounds with different political views, but with a sort of grievances towards a government that has been very unwilling to listen to alternatives. And when Abiy Ahmed came to power in 2018, there was this sense of like, he was the kind of the perfect figure that was combining, background in, the mother was Christian, the father was Muslim, he spoke many languages, he had a PhD in ICTs, he was from the Oromo group, the largest group in Ethiopia that had never dominated Ethiopia. So there was this sense of like exhilaration coming from everyone. And now I feel even the good friends and colleagues that we have worked with and are still alive in 2015, they will disagree so brutally on what is going on. The ground truth that Matti mentioned before as a concept in computational social science, and in order to train an algorithm, it's something that is really lacking in the very fabric of Ethiopia, even very good friends, which whom we could have had, and we can still have, open conversation, struggle. I think this intercodal reliability, which was a methodological thing, but was also a human thing, let's all agree on how we see this statement. I don't think it will fly. The situation is just so incredibly polarized that it wouldn't work. So it wouldn't be generalizable to me to Ethiopia itself. We can kind of give some suggestion in terms of like a decision tree, whether or not the politics should come in and out in this context. And I think every project has to make its own decision. Politics might be very relevant. It wasn't at the time, and so forth. But do they have the power to protect themselves? If you go to Myanmar, that question is a stupid question. The Rohingya don't have the power, so why putting it there? And but in others might. So it's more of a Lego rather than a set of like as a template, and it's up to the core aim.
But would they disagree if you say this is an insulting statement about something? This is would the two sides really disagree on what denigrates a person in a statement? Would they really do that?
Well, I would say, again, being a layered set of decision on certain things, I would expect not, if you use certain terminology, but on others, I would, maybe Matti and I should go and pick up a couple of statements from last month and see how it would work, because
maybe Iginio, just quickly jumping in this, there are certain terms that are even understood in polarized ways between the different participants of conflict. So for one, it might mean a liberation hero, whereas for the other, it might be the kind of thief that has been in government. And so while obviously there might be certain tonalities and modalities of conversation that are considered offensive, even so, I think one of the challenges that the situation like this would raise is that even the key terms that could be considered offensive might not be considered offensive by the other part of the party. And you can see that even in the European context, when you look at like far right versus hate speech debates, the same kind of dynamics are, in my view, also playing out, that certain terms become just understood in a very different way. So again, it becomes like selection and choice at that point.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Alexander Brown.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for a fascinating talk. I wanted to pick up on the issue around whether political identity or political affiliation can be a protected characteristics under hate speech regulations, hate speech laws. So I've got a book out called The Politics of Hate Speech with Routledge that looks at hate speech in 12 different countries. At least 2 or 3 of those countries, there's a very close overlap between ethnic-based hate speech and political-based hate speech. And I argue in a couple of places that even if speech were purely political-based, you can imagine a scenario in which a historically oppressed minority group by their political affiliation is subject to what we really should be calling hate speech. Say, take a pro-capitalist community in a communist society, or a pro-communist community in a predominantly Hindu society, or these sorts of examples. But I agree with you, in international law, certainly international hate speech instruments, that category is often neglected. And I think I heard you say that your instinct would be, other things remaining equal, to accept politics, political affiliation as a protected characteristic, but you haven't for the purposes of this study. I'm just wanted to ask, why would your instinct be to include political affiliation as a characteristic? Is it certain cases or certain laws you've looked at, or certain empirical evidence? Why would your instinct be to include that? Sorry, that's a long question.
No, it's a good one. Well, Matti and I have written about it, not in this chapter, but elsewhere. So we also have this, it's a long and complicated argument, but we also have to see where the ICCPR and similar international legislation were coming from. And we wrote about it in this edited book. It's available open access, called Digital Hate. In the introduction, we make a kind of long argument that we don't have time to go into. And that project coming out of the Second World War, there was a sense of like the kind of a ground truth, the sense of like moral suffering and moral certitude could allow to say, we can allow a higher threshold for politics because what we have to defend is this minority that we have seen what can happen when politics loads onto race, ethnicity, and so forth. But the project failed. Again, what we see is that different forms of political manipulation of the terms hate speech, and to one extent is not understood. So everybody says, oh yes, he's using hate speech, he's using like, and those who try to stick to that are seen as belonging to kind of the table of the liberal moralist, someone who sits on a high and sort of asserts to be on a higher moral ground and can judge others. Sometimes politics is essential, and politics is as disgusting as certain arguments can be, can't be taken away. And we make the arguments of like Steve Biko during apartheid South Africa, when he wrote, "I write what I like," which is very much that point. I write what I like, and that was considered by the apartheid regime not civil language. So it's a complex one. I know I'm not articulating all the reason why politics should be in, but in that book we have proper space to say why and to which extent sometimes politics should become part of the equation in ways that can recognize the uniqueness. You mentioned some example of what is going into a specific space and not necessarily can be generalized everywhere. I don't know if you, Matti, want to add something.
Well, I can very briefly add that in the Ethiopian context, hate speech law has also been used for purposes that might not be entirely within the kind of human rights framework. So it has been often closely linked to terrorism proclamation, and has been used to also, according to some arguments, to quell or suppress opposition voices as a pretext for hate speech, or as the kind of using the term for hate speech. So again, it's also the law can be manipulated in different ways in different parts of the world. So yeah, I think that's the kind of what I would add to that.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Georgiana. She said, "Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. I do have two questions. If there's not enough time to address both, I would appreciate if only one is addressed." So question one, to what extent can one use hate speech online to predict the eruption of a conflict, considering that there are so many other variables in play, environmental factors, historical tensions, political decisions? When outlaying your framework, did you decide that in the Ethiopian case, hate speech overpowers other variables? That's the first question. Second question, totalitarian regimes were mentioned. Do you believe it is easier to keep internal conflict and hate speech under control in totalitarian regimes than in a liberal society?
You want to go first, Matti?
Well, I can talk about the prediction
Second.
very just quickly, the question one here. And I think there is a desire, and this was also part of how the Ethiopia research was funded, around trying to predict conflict based on online conversations. But as we know, that kind of prediction is very difficult to do. And oftentimes I would go as far as arguing that it's more important to not look at certain predictive models, but rather than try to understand why we want to predict. And it becomes a question of trying to mitigate certain risk, and there's a whole politics around prediction. So again, I would be very cautious of using the term prediction, eruption of conflict, as a form of using hate speech. Also, other variables might work into different ways there. And for the second question, it's I'll let Iginio answer that, because I don't think there is any general trend between totalitarian regimes and liberal societies, because societies tend to collapse very quickly. So something that seems to be completely authoritarian in control can, within, like it happened in Ethiopia, it can change very quickly. So it's very hard to have a very systematic way of looking at, in terms of keeping internal conflict and hate speech.
This is not an easy question. And again, if you break it down, it depends on, I just posted the link to this book that I mentioned before. I was typing something else, but then Matti caught me on the spot, so I will continue later. And we have a very powerful, and also in an edited collection on the International Journal of Communication that Matti edited with another colleague, Sahana Udupa. And we have a very good article on anti-Muslim sentiment in China, and how this takes the forms of, again, it's difficult to distinguish between humor, between like slur, targeting, and so forth. So it depends what hate speech, there is forms of hate speech that the tyrant regime thrives on and allow to happen and don't sanction as much as others. So it might look less as a war of all against all, like it could have been in the US during the Capitol Hill attack and so forth, but it's there, and but others are censored. To which extent the totalitarian regime can control its speech? I think China has been relatively good at that, but so was Ethiopia to some extent, until things completely collapsed. So again, it's like for how long you can keep the lead on whatever, like boiling pot, or like you decide. So and then the other point that it might be a bit less obvious and controversial, and Rebecca McKinnon a while ago in a book, can't remember the title, but she started calling Facebook and Google as if they were states. Google dominant, Facebookistan, and these have some of the trappings of states, and for the financial resources and so forth. But at the same time, we have to distinguish between a society that does certain things where hate speech is the norm, and where in some it might be very much online and not very much offline, and in others the two things can go hand in hand. But also certain states might be collapsing, and states, I mean, the Facebookistan, and we might just let them collapse. I would be very much in favor, rather than, this is an argument that I made with Matti a number of times, rather than putting a lot of efforts as researchers, as scholars, as academics, to polish a corporate space where this is happening. I would rather seeing just falling as many others have fallen, so something else can be built from the ground up that has no guarantee to be any better. And but certainly what we have got to have in our hands right now, it's not particularly good. So these countries might also become failed states, and I think it would be just fine, rather than trying to save it, polish, embellish it, so that we can all have this beautiful conversation that we were told we could have 5 years ago. It just didn't happen. Let's move on.
Great, thank you. And with that, I think we should kind of come to a conclusion, because we have about 1 or 2 minutes left. I think I'd like to, on behalf of everyone here, thank Matti and Iginio for their presentation and sharing their wonderful research. So thank you very much. A virtual applause. Great. And then I just wanted to let everyone know that we have another presentation next Wednesday by Katia Volk and Sheila Scott from IREX. And it's on building individual and community resilience to manipulative information online hate, lessons learned. So that should be a wonderful presentation as well. Again, thank you very much, Matti and Iginio. And with that, we will wrap up for today.
Thanks, Baba.
Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure.